Okay, we've been talking about facing the unforeseen. The challenge has been getting a handle, for me at least, getting a mental handle on what unforeseen means, all the depths of it. Because when something happens, you say, well, I should have seen that coming. Well, that may or may not be true, but it's still happening. It's still happening to you and me. Last week we looked at George Washington Carver's statement, said, how far you go in life will depend on your being tender with the young, compassionate with the aged, sympathetic with the striving, and tolerant of the weak and the strong, because someday you will have been all of those, every one of them, and that'll be true. Last week we talked about a little bit about life as it is, not as we would imagine. Because I do not know what's coming tomorrow. But everything that touches our lives and everybody that we touch involves this. It involves people, events, decisions, and results. And most of those surprise us every day. We deal with people that, I just picked up something this morning that I cannot tell anybody about. I just learned it 15 minutes ago. That it's one of those things that I learned that Brother Floyd, I wish I didn't know it. You know, there's a lot of things that God wants me to know, but I picked this up, and I just wish I didn't know it, and I can't share it, and it's not good. It's not good at all. But that's part of dealing with people, dealing with events. We deal with them every day. They happen. They surprise us a little bit. Things that we wish wouldn't happen do happen. Sometimes they happen to other people, or we think they're going to happen to other people, but they end up happening to me, and that really shocks me. Decisions we made, usually I look out for me first. I say I love my neighbor, I say I love God, but it gets right down to it, I'll take care of me first. You be assured of that. Most of us are that way. The results from it, I need to realize that if I'm not living in the will of God, sinful acts don't only affect me, they affect my family, they affect my church, they affect my friends, they affect my extended family. They kill my testimony. He just warns us some things. Life as it's going on right now wouldn't be like we would imagine it to be. There are all kinds of things that happen every day that surprise us, but our cushion comes, they do not surprise God. They do not surprise God. So anything can happen. And he closes with two or three things, and I'll get to where I was last week. I'm going to hurry. In spite of our sinfulness, weakness, and tendency to serve ourselves, we need to keep in mind that God remains all the things that we are not. And so, when the mate says, I'm leaving, or the daughter or granddaughter, either one, comes home and says, I think I'm pregnant, or all those other things, that means that the unforeseen is painful many times, but it's not impossible. We're going to go on. We're going to go on. God has a plan for you. So point number one, life as it is, not as we would imagine. Life as it was, not as we would expect, is the part that we're in right now, and I'm going to try to get caught up real quick. We talked about Job a little bit last week. Ideal situation, wealthy man, knowledgeable man, well thought of in the community. Had a lot of cattle, a lot of acreage, a lot of kids, had 10 kids. He lost it all in just literally a matter of hours. Job's world fell apart like a house of cards. And we talked about that. We talked about some other things, those phone calls that come in, that plane that went down, and then you remembered that flight number, you've got a friend on it or whatever. It happens to all of us at one time or another. And we wrestled around a little bit with Job last week. It's not a pretty wrestling match, because we realized that it could happen to us. What was the difference between Job and his wife's perspective to that? Maybe it's the same thing that would happen to me, Carol, and it might be the wife just saw the object, but Job saw the setting. He saw the larger picture. And you cannot deny the pain that's happening, but we just refuse to focus on the valleys, because pain happens to all of us. And so last week we were in the process of recovery. was the next section here, because Job and him had to recover. You've gone through some things. You have to recover. There's people depending on you. And he gives us about 4 things, and we were in the middle of those last week. The first stage is recover is the agony of humanity. Well, I'm responsible for this. It wasn't your fault after all, a parent of a autistic child or disabled child or 100 other things that could happen. Sometimes we just go through agony with it, the agony of just being a human. And then our struggle with theology. You know what Job's wife told him. Just curse God and die. Of course, she lost 10 children too. So don't be too harsh on her. Number 3, third step is what he calls the acceptance of reality. And we closed with this one last week due to the clock on the wall. We're all the same in so many respects, but our attitude toward things, a lot of times they're different. Job said to his wife, shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? It's coming. We'll either accept it or it'll kill us, or kill our testimony at least. And the last statement I think I made last week was, contrary to our Constitution, all men are not created equal. We're not all equal. We're all completely different, as a matter of fact. Our circumstances will be different. Our response to those circumstances will be dependent on where we believe God or don't believe God. And men, it doesn't hurt to cry. It doesn't hurt to cry. I got to get that in there. So, the 4th step, freedom from iniquity. I read this to Elaine this morning, and I can read fine, but I just don't like to read. I'd rather take it and put it in my own words. This situation, who will get the glory from it? Which way will we lean from it? Will we be drawn by Satan to just get mad and give up on life? I've been there one time. I didn't like it. Will it cause us to become alive in wisdom or paralyzed by bitterness? What's the circumstances going to be? These things that the world would call a bad situation, how are we going to respond as Christians? We have an inner power source that the world does not have. The world does not understand it. And many times I do not utilize it. I still lean on the energy of the flesh, and it's pretty weak. It's pretty weak. He said this, how quickly we choose one of 2 routes. And Tommy and I read this yesterday. I read it 25 years ago. And I read it to Elaine this morning as I was relating a story on the next page, and she said, I don't remember that story. And that's always dangerous for her to say, because I'll go back and reread 3 paragraphs in front of it to set it up. That's what I'm going to do to you. Circumstances go south on us. What do? He says we either, most of us quickly choose one of 2 routes. Either blame or self-pity. Then he tells us what they are. Both of them lead to a dead-end road. You ever been down a dead-end road? Somebody's torn the sign down that says dead end. You turn down there and drive 3/4 of a mile, and all of a sudden it just stops. Well, that's what he says about this. See if you agree with this. Blame makes us bitter. Look at that man, that coat on. He's pretty sharp. Blame makes us bitter. Self-pity makes us lonely. I don't want to be around somebody that's crying and moaning about their situation. A feel sorry for person, even if they are a victim. If I'm that way, you don't want to be around me, and I don't blame you. So early this morning, I laid this book out, and I reread a paragraph that I've read, I'm going to say 25 times. And all of a sudden, the light bulb came on. And I grabbed my red pen, which I never use, and I underlined this. And I'm going to read it to you this morning. And I think this is the crux of where we are, and we better not forget this. And I say, I didn't say you, I said we. And while I'm addressing, this is Chuck Swindoll speaking his heart some 30 years ago. And while I'm addressing common reactions, see, this is everyday stuff. This is not something a man just made up. These are things that he's experienced, either as a pastor or as a friend or as a brother-in-law or whatever. And while I'm addressing common reactions, something needs to be said. Something needs to be said against one person telling another that the calamity came as God's punishment. Oh, that's just God punishing you. Who told you that? God didn't tell you that. And you and I have no right to say it. He said this, it's been my observation that God reveals that to no one other than the sufferer. If I'm in that position, God will tell me about it. I don't need you to tell me. And I love you and I'm nice, but you have not been called by God to tell me why the reason is I'm suffering. You're to love me, take care of me, be patient with me, because I may say some things that normally I wouldn't say, or the other person will too. And then he said, let's be careful. Boy, I hate this word I'm going to read. Let's be careful not to play the role of the self-righteous prophet, substituting rationalization for reality. If it's real and it's going to happen, and I need to know it, God will tell me. Oh, we'll turn this around. You don't need me telling you, well, you're going through that because God's punishing you for not doing this. Now I'm going to read a funny story too. About time for one, isn't it? Y'all got awful quiet in here this morning. Years ago, I heard about a Kansas preacher who returned home after visiting New England. One of his church members met him at the train. They'll tell you how long ago it was. Well, asked the preacher, how are things here at home? Sad, real sad, Pastor. A cyclone came and wiped out my house. Well, I'm not surprised, said the pastor. You remember I've been warning you about the way you've been living. Punishment for sin is inevitable. It also destroyed your house, Pastor. Oh, it did. Ah, me, the ways of the Lord are past human understanding. There was a remarkable restoration to Job's situation. God gave him back everything double except one thing. He didn't give him 20 kids, he just gave him 10. I'm not sure 20 would have been a blessing. But he restored him back. Family back to completion. God has ways of showing us how powerful he is and also how much he loves us. Last section. And I forget these little sections. So I'm going to, and I know you do too, so I'm going to give it to you. The first one, now just picture these in your mind. If you're taking notes, jot these down. I hope some of you have ordered this book now. Life as it is, not as we would imagine. I wasn't going to do this, now I'm doing it. You got yours, Tracy? I apologize, I didn't have these marked. No, I knew you had yours. Yours had come in anyway. I apologize for this. I should have had these marked. Number one, life as it is, not as we would imagine. That's every day. That's tomorrow at 1:30. Whatever happens tomorrow at 1:30, you possibly would have not even imagined it. It may be good, it may not be so good. Then he tells us a little bit about this last one is life as it will be. Now we're talking about the future. We don't know what's going to happen, but he says this. He guarantees us some things. We see this in past experience, and we see this in the Word of God. Not as we would prefer. There's always going to be things happen that if I had my druthers, they'd be a little bit different. And he gives us 3 or 4 things here as we kind of wrap up our thoughts today. Life is not going to be as we prefer. Number one, we prefer no surprises. You know, I like to kind of stay kind of predictable, you know. And I know this is going to happen, and then after that, this will happen. But then sure as the world, something's going to jump right in the middle of it. He says, wouldn't it be great for God to tell us that now this is going to happen, this is going to happen, but this is not going to happen, so there won't be any surprises. How wise of him not to do that. He says here, how gracious of him to make it unpredictable. I do not want to know what's going to go on this afternoon. He unrolls it, each year he unrolls it just a minute at a time and gives it to us. And a lot of times it's a big surprise. Sometimes it's not so big. We're kind of expecting it. But usually it's a big surprise. For me to say I prefer no surprises is to say I don't trust God. Number two, we prefer no adversity. Everything goes smooth. I don't think anybody in here has experienced that yet, that everything just went smooth as silk. It may for a few minutes, maybe for an hour or two, but it's going to change because I'm a sinful creature and I have clay feet just like everybody else does. Life will continue to be painful and adverse for you and for me. And we lean on the one who gives us strength through all those situations. We bargain with God. Lord, if you won't let what happened to my neighbor happen to me, I'll help my neighbor. Lord, if we'll take meals and we'll provide affection and we'll carpool, we do whatever we have to, just don't let it happen to me. We start making deals with God. We prefer no adversity. We want everything to run smooth. And a lot of times it does. Matter of fact, most of the time it does. Adversity may not skip you or yours this year. I don't think it skipped anybody this year. We've had our adversity. It's been different. It's been deeper for some. It's hurt some more. But God is still in control. He's still calling the shots. We prefer, number three, we prefer pain at a distance. I don't like pain. I don't do pain. He says we want pain kept at arm's length, Carolyn, where it just won't get too close to us. But I look around and I can't read your mind. I can't read mine most of the time. But everybody in here has experienced pain this year. Most of us have experienced extreme pain this year. He says, suddenly I'm reminded about God and his plan for Jesus. Life rocked along fairly predictably. As a matter of fact, the scripture doesn't even record 18 years in there of his life. Then almost out of the blue, they start talking about the cross. Then Jesus told his 12 how it was going to be. They're like me. I would have been a typical disciple. I just don't catch on very quick. I'm kind of slow. But they couldn't imagine the whole thing. They thought it was just a bad nightmare. They couldn't see anything in the blood of Christ except tragedy. They just didn't hear him with spiritual ears. Sounds kind of like me sometimes. But God saw triumph. They saw iron nails and big pieces of lumber, but God saw himself lifted up to die for the sins of the world. And that spelled victory, because he knew Easter morning was coming. What they resisted, he ran to. They ultimately embraced and died for it later, though, when God got a hold of their hearts and hold their minds, and he'll do the same with us. So why does Chuck Swindoll tell us all this? This little outline and all this, it's the same. We're right where we were when we started. We're just a week down the road. I encourage you to continue being tender with the young, compassionate with the aged, sympathetic with the striving, and tolerant with the weak and the strong. And he said, may I add one more, ready for the unforeseen, because it's coming. It's coming. Someday you will not only have been all of these, but you will be wiser because of it. And the wiser we become, the more we become like God, because he's the only one that gives us wisdom. He's the only one that helps you see life from God's perspective. I'm not sure this is my favorite chapter in the book, but to me it's very, very important. And I'm going to encourage you, now that I found out they're available. How many people have a book? I know one,
What chapter are you
2,
in?
3. What chapter is this?
What chapter is it?
Facing the Unforeseen. I don't know whether they're numbered or not. It's in the last section. It's in the Part 4 section, Wisdom Claim While Weathering the Storm. It's number 11, chapter 11. facing the unforeseen.
What did you say, sympathetic with that, with what?
Oh, now,
With who?
now you're gonna make me go back and find it.
Nobody.
I'll tell you. Because it's worth going back and finding. Okay, tender with the young, compassionate with the aged, sympathetic with the striving. We have a lot of those. We have a lot of one-on-one relationships with people that are striving, don't we? And we may be on either side of the relationship. Don't forget that. Somebody may be ministering to us. And tolerant of the weak and the strong. Sometimes it's harder to be tolerant with the strong than it is with the weak.